Hello, this is Dread, and in today's video topic, this is going to be the Zero to Hero episode on the Meteor Sorcerer. So the idea is we take a character from level 1 without any stash or anything like that, completely fresh character, level it all the way to 10 out of 10 Harbingers, i.e. 300 Corruption, just to see its cycle starter capabilities. And this time, of course, we decided to play the lead developer's favorite skill in last Epoch, and that is Meteor. So if you don't know, Meteor has a very storied history of being a very bad skill. And recently, with the buffs to Sorcerer, it is now just a mediocre skill. It is playable, but it's not necessarily something I would suggest personally. I think that it's fun. It's got that going for it, but it's amazing how a 900% added damage effectiveness skill still struggles to kill and do single target on like the end game bosses. It's very saddening, but it's just how it is. One of the biggest problems currently is the nodes to grab the extra projectiles for Meteor kind of like reduce its single target capabilities as it increases the radius at which they fall, or like reduces the radius of which they explode in. And then of course to fix that, you have to run some area so that you get good overlaps, and then that's a lot of points. And pretty much Meteor is a very point intensive tree, especially if you even want to even try to run the base crit nodes. Now, of course, with higher levels of gear, Meteor could be better. The biggest problem is like we're comparing it to all of the other builds on this list that I've done. Remember, this is number 18, right? There are better builds that exist, even on Sorcerer, right? Hell, even the Volcanic Orb Rune Master was better than this build, right? So that's crazy considering how powerful Sorc is. Pretty much what I'm trying to say is Sorcerer is very strong right now, while of course Meteor is still very mediocre, unfortunately. But I still played it, and I still had a lot of fun with it for the most part, other than like maybe the last 10% of the playthrough of the Meteor Sorc, which involves just, single target situations, right? Because you just don't end up doing that much damage on a low budget. Of course, this might change with the set crafting, with the Velatria set, being able to run an item that gives you like one flat lightning per intelligence is pretty strong. That could be very strong also as well, converting it to lightning, which is technically a superior damage type than fire, which is cool. So overall, I think that there's potential to make Meteor work next patch. It's just my biggest problem currently with Meteor in general, okay? The biggest problem is, well, Sorcerer is insanely overtuned right now. There are like 20 billion reasons why Sorcerer is overtuned right now. So if they hurt any single thing that actually affects Sorcerer, right? Affects this build instead of like the builds that are overperforming, like for instance, Static Orb, right? If they just nerf generic Sorcerer scaling instead of nerfing, I don't know, the problem children in the room, like Frostclaw or of course Static Orb, right? Or Glacier, this means that Meteor will cop a nerf and a nerf and a nerf, which it doesn't really deserve. One of the biggest problems that I had with the build in general was feeling as though I was forced to run Arcane Ascendance, not because like Arcane Ascendance is necessarily good. It is cool reducing, getting a bunch of global mana efficiency for your meteors. It is cool, mind you, but it's not necessarily like the best skill ever. I would like to be using a different skill, but the problem is there is no other skills like that give any amount of utility currently of any like form. Like I could put down a Frost Wall to get like 12% more damage, maybe. That's like okay. But like Arcane Ascendance, unfortunately, is probably one of the better ways of abusing Meteor right now. Now, of course, I think with higher budgets, I think Meteor could be great, by the way. I just want to let you know that. It's just from a zero to hero, no gear whatsoever kind of perspective. If we were to compare it to all of the other builds that I've played on this list, like even like the ones that I've quote unquote failed, like the sorry about that. The Gathering Storm Beastmaster, I would say, had better single target scaling than this build had, mainly just because it just had better single target. It had terrible clear, but it had better single target, right? But the clear on this feels pretty okay. But this is the problem is like there's a lot of other builds that have just as good as clear, but also like twice to three times the single target. To give you an idea, okay, as of right now, my total time to kill a 300 Corruption Harbinger and the boss associated with it, the average time is 2 to 4 minutes. This build took around an average of 4 minutes to kill 300 Corruption Harbingers, right? Which means that this is like at the latter end of the average, right? It is definitely worse than other builds. So it's just, I don't know. It's hard to recommend something that I would call mediocre, but if you're going to end up playing Meteor, this is probably the way to go. So if you haven't already, I would heavily suggest leaving a like on the video and subscribing to the channel, as that is the best way of currently supporting me, and it's the best way to show me that you want more content like this on YouTube. Also, as well, I stream these attempts live on Twitch, so if you want to hang out and see what I do to level this kind of shit, come and hang out. Number 18. We really are just starting to get a little fatigued here. It is number 18, man. Like, this means I've killed 180 Harbingers so far just for this series alone, not including all of the other Harbingers I've killed. So, definitely starting to feel the fatigue, mainly just because I've had a taste of what I would call some of the more, broken builds in the game. So, playing stuff that isn't as good is definitely a little bit of a culture shock. Let's put it like that, right? But the plan for leveling right now for this build is to utilize just Glacier and Mana Strike until we get access to our mastery bonus, i.e. Meteor. Now, as I leveled with Meteor, let me tell you, it was not worth it early on. You would just be better off leveling with Glacier, as it is just a superior skill in almost every single way. But, I tried leveling with Meteor and it didn't get good until like maybe level 40-ish or something like that. So I would suggest leveling with Glacier until like level 40, 45 or something like that. But of course, you're going to get to watch me go through all the pain anyways, right? Yepers, like always, Glacier leveling. Nothing's really changed. I really do hope the leveling meta changes, but at the same time, it's not like as if it is going to change in any relevant way. One interesting thing, there's actually a one-shot cache right next to Haruspeck's Orion. It's like a two-handed spear that gives you like a bunch of flat spell damage on it and ignite chance. Turns out if you don't have a good item currently, like if you don't have like percent damage on your staff or something like that, it ends up being pretty okay if you don't end up with a better weapon, in my opinion. Now, let's skip to when we have access to Meteor. It's like kind of okay while leveling. So I went for a much more defensive setup while leveling. Personally, I don't like preparation early on as mage anymore. That's just because there's just so many things that can very easily kill you as a mage in general. I've noticed that like just going reactive ward is just better every single time. Sure, you kill things slightly less quickly, but turns out not dying is a huge improvement to your speed in the early game. Turns out like not having to worry about every single enemy completely land blasting you as a mage, it feels great. Like just having a reactive ward all the way through the campaign is probably one of the more comfier experiences in Last Epoch, and I feel almost naked without it as a mage currently. So, to each their own, but in my opinion, like not having reactive ward is insane. The biggest problem with Meteor early on, the reason why it doesn't feel like as good as Glacier is because you have to grab the node that gives a bunch of mana cost to it, but all you end up doing is like doubling the amount of meteors you get. Later on, when you get multiple meteors, when you get like 3 to 4 meteors, it doesn't feel as bad, but there's like an upfront cost per se, if that makes sense. Like the meteor storm stuff, right? There is like a decent upfront cost and you're kind of just like waiting till you get more points. As you can see, the damage isn't terrible. And of course, we can use Mana Strike to sustain. One thing that I did not do early on that I think that you should do is kind of like speed towards Mana Cleave on Mana Strike early on, as it just ends up being a better playstyle overall, like using Mana Cleave to like fill up your mana instead of like having to sit there and cast Mana Strike constantly. And of course, if you run out of mana still, you can just use Focus, and Focus isn't bad early on, even unspecialized. Now here's the Emperor Remains down. As you can see, the damage is very lacking on single target. I don't know what's going on. I don't know what's going on with Meteor, man. Because, like, you know, you'd think that with the 50% more damage from the mastery bonus, you'd think it'd be a lot better, right? And it has like 900% added damage effectiveness too. Because, like, if I was playing Glacier at this point, I'd just be demolishing him in general. But Glacier has significantly less, like, added damage effectiveness, right? But at the same time, Glacier also has, like, a third of the mana cost. So I'm not entirely sure why it feels like this. I'm not sure. I don't know why Glacier ends up feeling better. But usually it just kind of does. It just kind of does. Now we're going to speed up the leveling process just a little bit here. I did end up with a large amount of percent damage in the campaign here, and that helped out a lot, getting percent damage on my staff and getting percent damage on my chest and plus levels and all that. That definitely helped early on. It was kind of weird, the curve in general of how I felt. Early on, I felt like I was trash. In the mid game, to like level 38 or something like that, I felt insane. And then I got to Monoliths and I felt kind of meh. But then I got to Empowered Monos and I felt a little bit better. But then the moment that I did actually get to Empowered Monos, it kind of just went downhill from there. Now, it didn't feel terrible, mind you. And it took a lot of like reworking the build to feel good. Like, this is like one of the most times I've respected a character in general while in the Empowered Monoliths, because like I needed to like figure out exactly what I felt was comfortable personally. But like overall, I wouldn't really like rate this build very highly in general. Maybe I did something wrong, but I can tell you right now that like there aren't many other ways of specializing into Meteor that feel better, right? Here are the twins here, of course, because of the way that Meteor works, you definitely want to like combine them together and you're good to go. Now here's our first monolith here. So the playstyle of the build has not been a problem, at least in monoliths. It's nice just throwing down a bunch of meteors and watching things die. But like I said, having a skill that literally says 900% added damage effectiveness, it just doesn't sit right with me to watch a skill have that much added damage effectiveness but hit that little in the end game. I think it's just a combination of the skill tree not being that good, on top of course, the insane mana cost it gets. I make a few changes later on that makes it feel a little bit better for mana cost, but it's definitely not something that's enjoyable. And I think that's like the biggest issue that I have currently with Meteor. So here's our A-bomb kill. Now, this may look actually somewhat impressive for the uninitiated, but after playing the builds that I have and deleting A-bomb before he even has a chance to do anything in like 10 seconds, this feels slow to me. And I don't know if I'm spoiled or if Meteor is just not very good right now. Now, of course, thankfully, the Sorc changes definitely have buffed Meteor a lot. I will tell you that this run has gone way better than my regular Sorc runs in the past and stuff like that. And I think that like at higher amounts of investment, at higher amounts of mana, where you can really start pushing the mana envelope, like at like thousands and thousands of mana, I could see that being better, right? But at the same time, the problem is there are just better skills that exist right now, like Static Orb and stuff like that. And even if they nerf Static Orb and Glacier, let's say that they nerf those two, right? Frostclaw is still a pretty good option as well. Like crit Frostclaw is a pretty good skill. And it gets very close in terms of the damage effectiveness of Meteor while also not costing as much, maybe a third as much. God, it just feels kind of dirty. You know, like it feels so dirty playing all of these other builds that like kill Rye before I can even sneeze. And then I play a build like this, and then like Rye isn't like instantly deleted. Maybe I am spoiled. Maybe that's the problem. Because like maybe that's the problem, right? Maybe I legitimately am spoiled. Who knows? Let me know down below. Do you think I'm spoiled at this point? Do you think I've been playing too many powerful builds? That's why I usually try to like play off meta stuff, but I don't know. This just feels off to me for some reason. Now, I want to let you guys know, even with me being slightly negative about this build, the only reason I'm being so harsh on it is because I'm trying to uphold a higher standard for these builds because let's put it like this. If I'm struggling with it, then like someone who doesn't understand how the game works is probably going to struggle significantly more than me. And that's not necessarily what I would call acceptable, right? I'm trying to make content for people. Like the whole point of the Zero to Hero series is to play builds that I think that are good and are comfy. Cause like even like, let's say the Gathering Storm Beastmaster, right? The Gathering Storm EQ build, that build has slower single target than this, but it had very comfy single target. Well, this build doesn't have like what I would call comfy single target. It has kind of like sweaty single target. Here's our Lagon. As you can see, the damage in the single target isn't as bad, but like I said, if you compare it to some other versions of builds I've played recently, it's definitely like, you know, a little lackluster. But I'm really having fun with the build. I know, like I said, I'm like having all this like conversation about like the viability of the build and how I feel about it, but I actually genuinely enjoyed the build. I just wish that like Meteor could finally see its actual rise to power instead of just this like fart it's had. Here's our Emperor of Corpses. As you can see, you know, it actually is okay, but that's because it's much easier to shotgun on single target against him because, like, you know, of course, we put down our meteors and, you know, it kills them. Like, it's really simple, really simple. Here's our first 90 mono. As you can see, the build starting to finally like grow its wings as I'm getting more and more mana. And of course, as I get more and more mana, the more and more meteors I can spam. And this is where like the build really starts making its stride when you actually can cast multiple meteors in a row. Now, I do some refinements later on with the build that I found, as you'll see eventually. But right now, it's just like convenient to run focus and mana strike currently. But later on, there is some better options for you. I think right about now is when you should be swapping into Arcane Ascendance per se. But of course, you know, you don't really have that much defenses to make up for it. And I think that's like another thing that I would like to point out. Whenever I play these characters right now in the Zero to Hero series, for the most part, I try to go as defensive as humanly possible, like as tanky, because I'll be honest, there's nothing worse than dying right now in Last Epoch. Like, I usually like being tanky in the game currently because it's just very comfy. I don't like being at high corruption and being squishy. That's not necessarily a feeling that I enjoy. I know people do it, and I know that it is possible, and you're not punished too hard for doing so, but it's definitely not something I personally want to do. But here you can actually see, you know, being at 700 mana felt really good for this build. As you can see, beautiful. Here's our Herot. Herot's not very difficult of a boss fight currently. You just kind of just wait for his phases to go through, or you just generally skip them too. You can skip Herot's phases, by the way. If you do enough damage, you know, you won't see it here, but you'll see it in like some other builds, right, that I play. But yeah, overall, just fine. Good enough single target. Now, this is where the real cracks start to form. This is why I'm not going to recommend this build. Watch how much flailing I have to do on this character. just to look at that. Look how they move out of my like meteors, right? Constantly. That's not a very good feeling. Cause like let's say I miss a cast of like Glacier. That's like 40 mana down the drain. That's not that bad. But if I miss a whole cast of Meteor, that's like 120 to like 80 mana down the drain, right? Like it's a lot more punishing to miss a cast of Meteor than it is to miss a cast of like Glacier per se. So here's our first empowered monos. We're actually on the tankier side currently because we went for just a tankier setup. Now, of course, I could have went a lot more like just more like I don't know ZHP and go a lot more for DPS, but that would be unfair as almost every other build I've played, I've gone for the more of like a ZDPS setup where I go for as tanky as possible. So it would be unfair for me to treat this build any different currently in the current state of the game. Because like I'm trying to get a measurement of builds that still do good damage while also being tanky. And that's why I've been holding these builds to that standard. Is like I've been focusing on making sure builds feel tanky first, then do damage second. Now, of course, we're starting to get there. It's just, I don't know, the scaling later on doesn't feel as good. Now, to show you the DPS currently on this dummy as we get to empowered monos. Now, that seems like okay damage, like 100k per hit. I'm pretty sure you could scale that a lot harder if you put some effort into it, but it's definitely not necessarily the best DPS at this point. So here's the second Harbinger. I think I got really lucky as well with my gearing. I really don't think on average that you'd be at 800 mana at this point. I do actually reduce my mana later on, mainly in favor of being tankier because, in my opinion, being tanky is the most important thing first. But as you can see here, the Harbinger of Chaos isn't as bad because they have like longer situations where they stand still. Gannicus, thanks for the fall, by the way. But essentially, like, I don't know, it's missing some spice, Like, I feel like if I'm gonna like dump 800 mana, I should do more damage than that, right? Like, there's just this kind of feeling that like if I'm gonna be dumping this much mana into like damage and stuff like that, it really should just do like a little bit more than what it's doing. But yeah, maybe it's just because like Meteor's skill tree is like 4 years old at this point. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe the Velatrius set fixes it, but you could just play the Velatrius set on like every other build. You don't have to play it with Meteor, right? Which begs the question, why would you play Meteor at that point? As you can see, though, a little squishy here and there, even though I've put so much effort into survivability, but we still do it anyways. Now, here's our Oribus here, just to show you the difference between a boss that moves and doesn't move in terms of DPS. I feel like as though we have a decent amount of single target at this point, but it's hard to tell because, like, of course, things are moving out of your single target constantly. I do make some revisions later on, though. Now, here's the third Harbinger, Harbinger of Treason. This one was difficult, at least difficult in the way that, like, I'm constantly having to walk around and wait for the premiere time to strike. While if I was like playing any other build, I wouldn't have to worry about this. This is also about where I swap to the Arcane Ascendance setup. The idea is to turn on Arcane Ascendance and get that 60% global mana efficiency so that I can spew out more meteors. And for this setup, you're going to need a lot more cast speed than the prior setup did, which is fine. But the idea is you want to dump your entire mana bar as quickly as possible, then swap out of Arcane Ascendance, and then, of course, refill your mana with focus, and then repeat the process. Not only do you get like a large amount of percent damage, you get like 200% from Arcane Ascendance, you also get a bunch of cast speed as well, but it still doesn't feel as good as it should, right? At least in my humble opinion. Here's some 200 corruption gameplay. So this is about where my meteors started to fall off a little in terms of damage. The AoE felt fine, by the way, but the damage was starting to falter a little bit, right? Like it felt like as though I had to actually cast Meteor multiple times on certain enemies that have more HP than others, which is definitely not a good feeling. That's about where the threshold of where the build goes from feeling good to feeling bad starts. Uh I wouldn't mind if, like, Meteor didn't feel like that. There are ways of mitigating this by just, I don't know, stacking more damage, but those are the kind of things that you have access to maybe a week into the character and not a day into the character, right? When you have like a day's worth of gear on the character, you're kind of just scrapping by, and there are definitely better builds that perform better at this point of investment, right? I'm just surprised that I put so much effort into the Arcane Ascendance version and it still didn't fix my problems. Now, this was probably one of the worst harbingers to fight with this build. They just moved so much. They would put a lot of cold dots under my feet, and this build isn't the most visually it isn't the most clear build in terms of visibility, right? I'm pumping out a very large amount of meteors and I can't see. Like here, like look, there's like two cold dot auras under me on top of the big like cold wave. My eyes aren't as good as they used to be, dude. It would be nice if it was a little bit more visible. It's fine, but it's just like it does get a little obsessive after a certain point. But as you can see here, I'm just spending copious amounts of time trying to find DPS windows. Thankfully, I've done these fights so many times that I have essentially like quote unquote veterancy. Like I could do this on shittier builds, right? Which I have. But the problem becomes like, remember, I've been playing the game for hundreds and hundreds of hours, and I've been killing hundreds and hundreds of harbingers, right? Like, what about someone who just started the game, right? How would they feel about fighting this harbinger with this build? They would probably have a terrible time, right? Which is why I'm being so harsh on it. Because like I'm not vain enough to think that like um everyone is like good enough at the video game. Like I know that like there are people who are just starting out playing Last Epoch. I know there are people who don't play it as like seriously. So to be like, oh my god, this is amazing, even though like I had a mediocre time, right? Like I don't know. It's hard to like discuss these kind of things because of how much garbage there is on YouTube constantly. Because what I would call a mediocre build, a different channel would be like, oh my god, this build is the best thing since sliced bread, right? But yeah, just for this series, I would call it mediocre. I think that like if you actually scaled it into endgame properly with actual stuff and actual items, and you actually went over 1,000 mana, which is a big break point for this build, by the way, I'm sure you'd do a lot better. But right now, it's just in that really awkward spot where I can't recommend it, but it still wasn't a terrible experience, right? Now here's some 280 corruption gameplay. I've been kind of like figuring out that you want to push as fast as possible right now. To get to your 10 out of 10s as quickly as possible, you want to use all of your envies towards pushing up corruption and get as much corruption as possible, right? So that you have more chances of getting Harbinger needles, which then, of course, feed into itself, which means more corruption and better farming and all that. So I've been pushing my builds to the absolute limit. That might also be partly what this is about too, because I think the last 5 Harbingers at 300 corruption, because you can fight like all the Harbingers like sequentially, right? In terms of corruption, you can like fight one at like 200C, 210C, 220C, or whatever stuff, or I think it's like 25 intervals, right? 225C and stuff like that. But like that's just inefficient time-wise. If you have to, fight the harbingers at less difficulty, that means like less chances for envies to drop, less chances for needles to drop. So it just ends up being kind of like inefficient. Now, of course, not everybody needs to be efficient in the video game, right? But in terms of this series, I'm trying to be as efficient as possible because I want to, push everything to the limit, right? Because if I'm pushing these to the limits and I'm like still having a good time, someone who's like just casually playing the video game is going to have a much better time, right? But if I'm having a mediocre time when I'm pushing the limit, the person who's copying this who doesn't have that many hours in Last Epoch is probably going to also have like a mediocre time, right? Which I definitely don't want to be the, sire of mediocre experiences, right? Now we're going to be in the boss rushing phase. Harbinger of Defilement, down. Harbinger of Tyranny, also down. Well, once I actually, generate enough mana, right? One day when I do. There you go. Another Harbinger of Defilement down. I don't know why they have the same name, by the way. I'm confused about that as well. Now, of course, the last Harbinger. I'm going to play this whole entire clip in full because I want to give a full synopsis of how I feel about the character because I want to be more analytical about this one. So if you look at my passive tree, my tree for Meteor, it might seem like there's some inefficiencies. Let me tell you, I couldn't figure out exactly how I should spec Meteor, but I preferred the way of reducing the mana cost of Meteor and just casting more meteors. It's just felt better to me in the end. Just like getting into that arcane ascendance, casting more meteors in general, that has felt better for the build overall, I will say. Now, of course, because of this, because like Meteor is such like a, point horror tree, right? That means I need a lot of plus levels to make this work. Now, we could fix this by getting plus levels on our amulet. We can get +2 on there. We can get an extra +2 on our chest, right? We could get a +1 on a staff if we fix our defensive issues and we're not running, of course, the offhand for the ward stuff, right? But entirely talk about it, right? It wasn't the best experience ever, and I did not entirely enjoy it, but still I played it. That's all that matters, right? And it's funny because it's average. It's the average speed of which these builds like function in the 10 out of 10 run. There's just something awkward and off-putting about the build, specifically the amount of gameplay knowledge required, like the combo of like having to go on Arcane Ascendance, casting all your meteors, then knowing when to use focus. It's not something that like I think your average video gamer is going to enjoy. I think the average Timmy that wants to be like, oh my god, let's spam meteors, they're not going to be in that kind of like situation where they want to do this much rotation just to make their build work, right? I feel like the Timmies are definitely the people who are looking for like the one button build variety of content where like you don't have to press that many buttons, right? So definitely can't recommend it there. I think that the way to fix Meteor would be just to make its more damage modifiers and its tree just more functional. Also, as well, to just reduce the amount of points I have to take. Like, for instance, right now with my current investment on my tree, I have to like spend like 4 points just to get the base crit on Meteor. The reason why we get the base crit on Meteor currently and not run like a catalyst for crit per se is because I want to actually be tanky in the end game, right? Like here, you can see I'm at like 2k ward and 2k HP. If I didn't have my offhand right now, I would be insanely squishy right now. Just overall really squishy, and I would have quit the build by now. So that's why I'm not running a crit catalyst. You could swap to a crit catalyst, but you'd also just die constantly. And that's not necessarily the kind of gameplay that I want to suggest to someone watching this video, right? Like, if I wanted to do that, I would play ZHP Falconer, because at least then that build does enough damage to make up for the fact that you're squishy enough, right? So, all in all, pretty mediocre experience. There are builds that take this entire concept. Like, I'm pretty sure if I swapped to Volcanic Orb, I would have had a much better experience. So maybe we'll try Volcanic Orb next. But with all that being said, let's go in game and talk about the build more in detail. I'm kind of waiting for me to kill this guy. Please kill him already. God, look at those poo-poo numbers. There you go. Thank you. All right, so here we are in game. Let's talk about the build in detail, shall we? So for Meteor, this tree, I'm pretty sure there are ways of refining it a little bit, but the problem with Meteor right now is it's taxed heavily, okay? Because of the nodes here, the reduced radius per Meteor, this means that your single target is worsened by this node, meaning you need a decent amount of area to make up for this. So we have 50% area here, which we could get rid of if we manage to get an increased area slot here or on our amulet. I did not manage to get one. So that's another +2 that we could get back from our Meteor and put it into more damage or Craterborn, right? Eventually. That's the plan anyways. With Extinction here, we could fix that if we want a crit catalyst, but then that would make us extremely squishy. I'm going to let that go down while we talk about this, but essentially that's going to make me really squishy. So eventually, in theory, with extra plus levels and better gear, you could, in theory, make this better. But at low gear investments, it's definitely not what I would call good. Like, look at that. Like, look at the difference in ward. Like, let me put on my opulent focus, right? Like, completely just complete difference, right? In terms of survivability in general, just getting all that nice ward per second. Eventually you can get out of it, maybe if you had better gear than what I currently have. But of course, this is 0 to hero run, so we don't have gear here. Arcane Ascendance, the idea is to grab Acuity so that we cast 4 to 16 spells. No longer drains mana, but it adds a cooldown. It's a lot better this way. We don't want to drain our mana. We want to sustain our mana. And then this also allows us to grab Tranquility, which is 60% global mana efficiency, by the way, which is a lot. And the idea here is we abuse the 50% cast speed from Arcane Ascendance, and we get cast speed on our gear and stuff so that we pretty much just dump our entire mana bar, right? And then swap out of Arcane Ascendance as quickly as possible. When you actually run out of mana, you actually get kicked out of Arcane Ascendance automatically. So that's a huge quality of life benefit if you can dump your mana bar very quickly with this setup. So that's definitely a goal that you should have in general. But other than that, just getting even more % damage, getting the cooldown so you can spam Arcane Ascendance. Pretty much everything you need for this. Teleport here, just the free spell stuff. This just makes it so you sustain your mana pretty easily while in monoliths, but other than that, it's like not too important. Just mainly trying to make it so that, you know, your monolith gameplay doesn't feel like ass. Focus here is very important, obviously, going for null profusion and null infusion, and we also get a decent amount of mana from the burst from focus. We're also grabbing Iron Stance. This actually allows us to tank things that we shouldn't be tanking in general, like just generically, right? Like I can sit in boss attacks when I'm channeling focus. So if you time your focus channels right, you can end up tanking way more than you'd think you would be able to. And then of course, Flame Ward, as it is one of the strongest utility skills in the game. And that is pretty much it for skills. Let's talk about passives that are important. Of course, the biggest thing is to rush all the way to Archmage for the reduced mana cost, and then try to get as much flat mana as possible. Right now, my tree is a little fucked up because we would like to have all the flat mana from stuff like this, but we really aren't able to run it right now. I would like to eventually run Mana Shell, but we need like as much intelligence as possible to make the build feel good and to cap our crit, because It feels really bad when a meteor does not crit. So capping our crit is our number one priority with this build. Of course, when we get more plus levels like passives, we're only level 90. And of course, as well, eventually we could go out of Spirit Protection. I was trying to fill out Unsealed Mana for cast speed because you want as much cast speed as possible with this build, low key, because you want to like spam your mana bar and then get out of it because you don't want to be standing still in Arcane Ascendance forever. So that's what I was trying to do, was trying to grab mana. I mean, trying to grab cast speed and flat mana. But that's pretty much it. Also, as well, I am playing hybrid, so I'm running reactive ward with Silver Rune. So we get a large amount of ward every single time we take any damage, which makes up for being squishy as a mage, especially without that many ways of gaining a ward. You must be wondering, Dread, why aren't you running Lost Knowledge? The problem with Lost Knowledge is we are constantly at like almost negative mana all the time. This node is not good anymore for builds that I'm playing right now, this build, but it's way better for a build like, of course, Glacier, where you stay at your high mana cost, right? It is definitely not good for the build that we're currently playing right now. I could probably refine this more. I might have made some mistakes here and there, but I'm pretty confident in my decisions that I made them correctly, especially in terms of Meteor specifically. Let's talk about gear. No mandatory uniques this time around. The only thing I would say is trying to get area idols here, an area on your gear. The more area that you have, the more chances that you have to have good single target, because you need to hit a certain threshold to make sure that all of your meteors are hitting the same target, because with that reduction in radius, you are randomly chanced to not hit the enemy, which is not good. So you want to kind of force your hand a little bit by grabbing a little bit of area here and there. And of course, mana spent gained as ward makes you feel pretty good in the end game in terms of chunk. Now let's talk about the gear here. Just flat mana, intelligence, HP. The Tyrant Crown base is pretty good as it gives us leech, helps us leech our decent life pool. Amulet here, mana. Eventually you'd want crit or crit multi there, or percent damage, and of course shred, and then HP, and then whatever else you can shove there, probably on a better base. The wand here, Crystal Wand is the best here for this slot currently, other than Wrong Warp. Wrong Warp would be better, but we don't have access to that because, of course, 0 to hero, right? Lots of flat mana, then of course crit chance, percent damage, pen. I think instead of that crit chance, I should have went for cast speed, so I can dump my mana bar faster and make the build feel better, but I wasn't like playing that version at the time. But we did manage to get a fire pen roll on it, which is pretty good. That's actually why I'm not running Craterborn right now, is because of the 15% fire pen on the tree, and of course as well the 12% here. Grabbing Craterborn actually isn't that much DPS currently. Eventually it would be DPS when you have enough plus levels of skills and when you fix, this conundrum with extinction. But right now it's definitely not worth it. But later on, when you have better gear than I do, you can definitely swap into it. Here's my chest here. HP, Meteor, mana on a good base. All you can really ask for. One thing to note, I would try to beeline towards 1,000 mana as quickly as possible. I was trying to, but I also don't think it's realistic to get to 1,000 mana at this point, especially if you want to be actually tanky while you play the video game. So that's why I tried to not super rush for it per se. I think getting to your 1,000 mana mark is something that you do later on when you actually spend your favor juice, right? Because like if you're in trade, or like, of course, COF, you use your prophecies, you'd actually be able to reach that. But of course, I don't usually try to spend my prophecy juice if I can help it, just to make it a lot more realistic for people. Now, as well here, Opulent Focus, crit multi, crit chance, resistance. I even sealed cast speed on it. Opulent Focus is probably one of the most strong base types in the game right now. It is the glue that keeps ward builds functional right now in the early game, as not only is it it's 100% retention, it also has, of course, 50 ward per second, while also having 40% increased damage at the base there, or up to like even more than that, right, with the implicit, and as well, it just has offensive implicits as well. So it's like a shield with offensive implicits. Very strong right now. Eventually, you could dump this when you just have generically better gear than I do, but right now, it is like our lifeline to feeling actually tanky instead of feeling squishy. Ring here, intelligence, eventually crit chance for percent damage, HP resistance on a decent base. Belt here, cooldown recovery speed. We want to dump our mana and refill our mana as quickly as possible with focus. So having cooldown recovery speed here and there is good for you. Ring here, HP, intelligence, resistance. Eventually you'd want a better prefix there. Although attunement, it's not that bad because it does actually give us some mana, but it's like not that big of a deal. Cast speed here, mana, then HP eventually on a better base. Boots here, cooldown recovery speed, HP, movement speed on arcane boots. Arcane boots are actually pretty good for us because we can end up with a decent amount of ward decay threshold. Then, of course, as well, our relic here, intelligence, crit chance, or crit multi, then HP resistance. And then for our idols, just mana spent gained as ward, or you can run percent mana idols as well. That works as well. And of course, the area with elemental skills so that we can make sure our meteors are shotgunning on single target. Now, with all that being said, this has been Dread, off to go do something else. Bye.